Alright guys, welcome to video number 11. As promised, here is your video on inheritance. So we'll be talking about inheritance in this video and what that entails. The way to think of inheritance is we just learned about cascade, right, in the CSS. So cascade is to CSS what inheritance is to HTML. So I'm going to make a change here to my document to prove how this works. I'm just going to add some text here and wrap it with an emphasis tag to prove what's going on. So we'll say Bulldogs flag football main header. Okay, now I could have done this with any of the tags that I already had, but this is just, I already have this CSS set up for this H1 from a previous video, so I'm just going to demonstrate it with what we have here, because this is already set up for us. So we'll go from there. So basically, we'll talk about what inheritance is. Inheritance describes what happens in the HTML when elements inherit stylistic properties from a parent element. So basically, when you have an element like, for now, this emphasis, right? So this emphasis tag here highlighted in purple is inside of this H1 tag right here, right? So you can think of it as the emphasis is the child of the H1 and the H1 is the parent. And similar to real life, parents pass on their genes to their kids. So think of the div as the parent to the H1 here, and it's going to inherit any styles we give to that. This div is the parent of this div, as well as anything below that. And the ultimate parent on any HTML page is the body tag, right? Because it's the parent to everything else on the page. Okay. So inheritance can be both a blessing and a curse, and it's very important to understand how it works. Reason being, it can cause confusion across multiple style sheets, especially when you're debugging your CSS. On the plus side, though, it's a good way to minimize the amount of CSS you write. As you can imagine, if you can apply proper styles to the parents, you don't have to rewrite those styles, those properties, and those values to all your children. You only have to write the specific ones that you need to override along the way. So I'm going to show you an example of that right now. So give my mouse here a second to catch up. Just, and generally inheritance is something that happens naturally with the HTML. The only thing we're going to do here is we're going to override what a child's properties are to see the differences. And apparently the first time I recorded this I was saying a lot more. Hopefully it wasn't too important. It's actually because the video slows down a bit here, so we gotta wait for it to catch up. Alright, there we go. Sorry about that. So here's the H1. Our selector from the previous video, we applied a font family with the different fonts it can select. We gave it a font size, and we gave it a font color. So that's going to apply to anything inside of the H1, right? So anything inside the H1, which includes this emphasis tag that's inside of the H1 tag, right? So all those styles are going to get applied to everything across here. Only difference is the emphasis is going to do its magic and italicize the main header section. So let's go take a look at my file here in a browser. So you'll notice here, Bulldogs flag football main header, right? So the main header section of the header is italicized, right? Because we have the emphasis wrapped around it. But it took on the other properties from its parent, which are the size, the actual font type, and the color. So all that matches the Bulldogs flag football, except it's emphasized, so it's italic. Okay. So now, if I go here, and I'm going to say, okay, well, that's great, but I need to change what the child looks like. Alright, so in this case, it's the emphasis tag. And using what we learned in a previous chapter here, I'm just going to add a different color to the emphasis. Okay. and save that out. And it's going to do exactly what you probably expect it to do, is this emphasis tag is going to override just the color of its parent, because it's picking up everything else except the color at this point. Okay, so override it, and there you go. Our main header now is red, and the rest of the text is blue. Okay, so the child has now changed out something from its parent. Alright. So as you can see, I mean, as your CSS file gets really long, you can see where this gets more and more powerful. One of the things that I'm going to recommend, and it's recommended for all websites, is that when you start your CSS, that you start with the body. If you write your body first, then you can apply just some general styling to the entire page, like the margin of your layout, the font family you generally want to stick with, the background color of everything, the color of the font, the default color of your fonts, maybe a starting point for the size of your fonts, where you can then scale relatively based on other elements. And we'll talk about sizing in a different video, and fonts in a different video. But you can see where it gets powerful, and we're going to start with the body when we start ours, and then everything else is going to change out individually as we need to make changes to each individual child. But it saves us from having to write a bunch of code later on. So we're going to start with the body, have it inherit, or pass on its genes, so to speak, to all of these children, and then each of the children we're going to make specific changes to. Okay? So hopefully that all makes sense. Your book also has a section on inheritance, which we'll get to here in a second. But generally this is a pretty easy idea to understand, and it's similar to the cascade. And sometimes people get the two confused. They think inheritance is cascade, but it's not. Cascade refers to the CSS, the order you write the CSS in, and or you lay out the files in, and inheritance is the order of your HTML elements and how they pass on their genes. So your book on page 72, chapter 3, I would recommend reading his example here. He has an example. Let me see if I could zoom out or zoom in, make this easier to read a little bit. Alright. Just so you understand how this breaks apart, at the top here he has the browser example, so what it looks like in the actual browser window. Below that he has the HTML that's written above, and then at the very bottom the CSS that he's applying to these elements. Okay, and then he kind of writes out what's happening in the content here. So the first line says, this span inherits font from its ancestor, which in this case is the body. So if you look at the code, span contains all the content, and it's picking up the body font family and font size. Okay, and next he has, scroll up here in a second, the div is given a line height, so anything inside the div now is going to inherit a line height of 2 ems, and we'll talk about ems at a later point. That's the size, but it's the space between the lines here. Okay, and then next is the p tag that he's given some letter spacing to, so the space between the letters after this p tag is all going to be the same. So anything after that's inside the p tag is going to get inherited, right? So that's the space between all these letters. And then the m tag, which he's given a font style of italic, which is fine, but emphasis, that's what it does by default. You'll notice that the emphasis starts here and ends here, and it contains all the content, but none of the content is actually italic if you go up and look into the browser page up above. Okay, so if you look at it, it's none of it's italic. The reason being is that he's overridden this with a span that needs to have a font style of normal, so not italic. And the span is a child of the emphasis, so the span would have originally been italic and inherited that property, but because we've given the span a specific style that overrides it, it is now not italic, so none of it's italic. Okay. And if you go to the next page here, page 73, he's got some good information here. The list of all the properties that do get inherited by certain elements. Okay, inline elements, what they inherit, terminal block elements, what they inherit. So good to read through that. Non-inherited, so the different properties that do not get inherited by children. Okay, which there are some. And then he just gives you some limitations and some tips on how to work with that. So that's it for inheritance. Hopefully that all made sense. And on the next video.